So you actually have two things you're going to be working on today. If you see this assignment, the causes of the Civil War chart, it says that we're going to be completing this over multiple days. So we'll start it today and you will finish it and be ready to submit it next Tuesday before Thanksgiving break. We'll have covered all the events leading up to the Civil War. So you'll be working on that and filling in a couple of events on there today. And then I'll go over the second assignment at the end of this. So the causes of the Civil War chart, this basically breaks down each of the main events that led to the Civil War, and you're going to put the date. So we've already talked about Uncle Tom's Cabin, you know that it was published in 1852. You would put what it is, how the North and the South responded, and then how it helped lead to the Civil War. So you guys are going to fill in Uncle Tom's Cabin on your own because we already covered that this week. And then today in this video, you'll find the information for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and for the caning of Charles Sumner. So let's talk about those two events and see how they helped lead to the Civil War. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, and it creates the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska. And this act said that white male settlers would determine through popular sovereignty if there would be slavery or not. Remember, we learned about this word popular sovereignty. It was part of the Compromise of 1850, and it stated that settlers would be able to vote on if their state would have slavery or not. But in order for that to happen, the Missouri Compromise had to be repealed. So if we look at this map, this is the Compromise of 1850 map. Remember, this was Henry Clay's last compromise. This compromise dealt with this territory right here after the Mexican-American War. So as part of the compromise, California joined the Union as a free state, but it said that the rest of this territory from the Mexican-American War would be decided through popular sovereignty. Remember, it's only dealing with this area. But we have this unorganized territory on the map that was above the 3630 line. And according to the Missouri Compromise, this area was closed to slavery. However, what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it takes that 3630 line away. And it says that now in this territory from the Louisiana Purchase, that the states can vote, so through popular sovereignty, they can decide if there would be slavery in this area. So they took away the compromise that Henry Clay made, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The 3630 line goes away, and now instead of these areas being closed to slavery, they could potentially be slave states if the citizens of that state voted for slavery. And this is going to create a lot of problems. So what this leads to is an event called Bleeding Kansas, which lasted from 1854 to 1856. Bleeding Kansas was a civil war in Kansas between pro and anti-slavery groups. Now that they can vote on slavery, it's going to create a lot of problems. So a lot of pro-slavery people from Missouri had been crossing the border into Kansas to vote illegally. So because Missouri was a slave state, you have people from Missouri going into Kansas because they also want Kansas to become a slave state. Well, in addition to that, you also have anti-slavery people who are in Kansas. And there's one man specifically named John Brown who supported the anti-slavery cause. And he actually killed 5 pro-slavery men in Kansas before fleeing. And we're going to come back to John Brown in a little while and talk about him when we get closer to the Civil War. But for now, he is supporting the anti-slavery cause in Kansas, and we see that this is going to lead to conflicts between pro and anti-slavery groups. So a little bit of information about John Brown. He was an abolitionist. He had been involved in the Underground Railroad, and he moved to Kansas specifically to support the anti-slavery cause. So as popular sovereignty opened up this territory, we see both pro and anti-slavery groups moving into the region. And so he kills 5 pro-slavery settlers, like I said. It was called the Pottawatomie Creek Massacre before he flees Kansas. And so John Brown is known a lot as a fanatic. He used religion a lot to justify his beliefs. Like I said, we're going to come back to him later as well, but we see it's kind of a mini civil war that breaks out, and then this is kind of a foreshadowing of the Civil War that will take place later. I'm going to link you guys to this video because I can't play it right now. You won't be able to hear it. So I'll put the link to Classroom so that you can watch this video that explains more about why the Kansas-Nebraska Act was such a big deal. So in addition to Bleeding Kansas that takes place, all of the events that are around the Kansas-Nebraska Act are leading up to something that takes place called the caning of Charles Sumner. The politics at this time are really on the verge of just falling apart because of pro and anti-slavery factions.
Alexander Euler, if you're in the building, can you please
And
come
so
up to the front office, please?
we see this
Thank
specifically in Congress, that violence erupts literally on the floor of Congress. So Charles Sumner was a representative from Massachusetts, and he gets up in Congress and gives this speech called Crime Against Kansas, where he blamed all of the events surrounding the Civil War in Kansas on people who supported slavery. He specifically is blaming slave supporters from South Carolina, and he insults the South Carolina representative Preston Brooks. So Preston Brooks was a representative from South Carolina, and he gets really upset that Charles Sumner is accusing pro-slavery groups of being responsible for the violence that broke out in Kansas. In fact, he gets so upset and so angry that he takes his cane and starts beating Sumner on the floor of Congress. So he's literally beating him with his cane. He beats him unconscious. He does not kill him, but it shows that leading up to the Civil War, that politics even is becoming extremely violent, that it's becoming really hard to maintain the peace in the nation. And so the South's reaction to this, they view Preston Brooks as like a hero. In fact, they send him canes as mementos for what he did for standing up for slavery and slave supporters. And for the North, they view Charles Sumner as a martyr because he stood up for what he believed in, and he's going to gain a lot of popularity amongst Northerners and abolitionists. But what we see again is we see kind of this disintegration of politics. Henry Clay is no longer around to create compromises and maintain the peace, and so things are continuing to spiral downhill. I'll also link you guys to this video. It's about a minute long that explains how the Civil War was a result of the caning of Charles Sumner as well. So you'll use that information to fill in this chart for the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the caning of Charles Sumner, and then we'll continue with some of these other events later in the week. The other thing you're going to complete today is using this map and the information you know about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You're going to complete some questions about that. And the last question is kind of your opinion, but some of these other ones we'll go through and talk about some of the events surrounding the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the ideas that were involved in it. So if you have questions as you're doing this, just let me know.